The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Katie Morrison moved through the pre-dawn corridors of Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver, her scrubs 2 sizes too large, her movements economical and precise. Nobody looked up. Nobody ever did. The badge clipped to her pocket read Katie Morrison, RN, and that was all the hospital knew, all anyone needed to know. She pulled open her locker on the 3rd floor, cardboard edges worn smooth from 3 years of handling, and there it was, the jacket. Faded olive drab. Inside the left lining, barely visible unless you knew where to look, a unit patch from Naval Special Warfare Group 2 stitched with dark thread. Her fingers found it before her conscious mind registered the gesture. She touched it the same way every morning, a talisman, a prayer, an anchor to something the world had decided she was allowed to forget. The morning smelled like antiseptic and someone spilled coffee. Katie filled her lungs slowly, held the breath for a count of 4, released it through her nose. The technique worked most mornings. The smell didn't trigger the memory quite as hard when she controlled the breathing, when she held the power. That was the difference between then and now. Then, the smells owned her. Now, she owned them. She closed the locker quietly and moved into the hallway, her footsteps barely audible on the linoleum, the way footsteps stayed quiet when lives depended on you not being noticed. Sacred Heart's cardiac unit occupied the 4th and 5th floors. The morning rounds hadn't started yet. That meant 30 minutes of relative silence before Dr. Sterling arrived with his residents trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. Katie had never spoken to him directly. She'd heard him speak, heard the edge in his voice when he addressed the nursing staff, heard the way he pitched his words just loud enough for everyone to absorb the contempt underneath. She preferred quiet. Quiet had kept her alive through 3 tours in Kandahar. Quiet kept her invisible. Invisible meant safe. She began reviewing the overnight charts on the computer terminal at the nurse's station, her eyes moving across the screen with the methodical precision of someone trained to absorb detail rapidly. Vital signs. Lab values. Medication orders. The data told stories if you knew how to read them. Mrs. Chen in 4207, stable post-op, vitals excellent. Mr. Ramirez in 4215, minor arrhythmia, nothing concerning. And in 4219, the new admission, post-op valve replacement, recovering well, the chart notes were sparse but complete. She filed the information away in the compartment of her mind where everything important lived, organized and accessible. That was when she saw it. The line item that didn't belong. Cardiac unit supplies, cardiac support equipment rental, $8.47 for a single day. Katie scrolled through the inventory notes. They'd used standard post-operative monitoring equipment. Nothing specialized. Nothing that would justify that cost. She clicked to the previous patient's chart. Same supply charge. The patient before that. Same again. 3 days of billing for equipment the floor didn't use, or if they did, the volume didn't match the cost. She made a note in her personal log, a habit from fieldwork, a documentation of the kind that saved lives when investigations came. Then she closed the file. She didn't notice Dr. Sterling standing near the corner of the station, a coffee cup raised to his lips, his eyes tracking her face with the intensity of someone hunting. He was younger than she'd realized, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of expensive watch that cost more than Katie's monthly rent and the kind of jawline that came from a childhood of privilege and good genetics. His white coat bore the emblem of a senior cardiologist, the double stripe of someone with authority. He lowered the cup slowly, watching the way her jaw tightened as she reviewed the numbers, the way her fingers paused on the keyboard, the precise moment when her eyes went from curious to understanding. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just identified a threat. Katie felt the weight of his attention the way prey animals feel the shift in air pressure that precedes a predator's strike. She didn't look up. She never looked up. Instead, she moved smoothly from the terminal, clipboard in hand, and began making rounds. Room 4207. Mrs. Chen was awake, vitals strong, pain controlled. Katie checked the foresight, no redness, no swelling, no signs of infiltration, and adjusted the flow rate with practiced efficiency. Has your pain level, Mrs. Chen? On a scale of 1 to 10. Maybe a 3. The medication is helping. Katie nodded, made a note, moved on. Efficiency. Kindness. The absence of wasted motion or wasted words. She moved like someone who'd learned long ago that speed and precision kept people alive. Fast enough to get ahead of complications. Careful enough to never miss a detail. She moved like someone who'd done this in a trauma tent with mortar rounds striking the perimeter walls and the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with blood and the sound of helicopters like thunder trapped inside a metal box. By 8 o'clock, the cardiac unit was fully staffed. Morning rounds began at 8:15, which meant Dr. Sterling and his trailing residents would sweep through each room like a surgical team on a mission. Katie stayed in the background, charts organized, vital signs current, medications ready. The residents didn't look at her when they rounded. Neither did the attending physicians. She was furniture. She was competence rendered invisible. Dr. Sterling entered room 4219, the post-operative valve replacement, and Katie followed 2 steps behind the cluster of white coats. She carried the latest chart, the updated lab work from the morning drawer, all the information he would need. The Marine General lay in the hospital bed looking frail in a way that seemed impossible, his skin paper-thin, his breathing shallow but steady. But his eyes were sharp. She'd noticed that yesterday when she'd admitted him. Despite the drugs, despite the surgery, despite 3 days of recovery, his eyes remained alert and present. He watched Dr. Sterling approach with the wariness of someone trained to assess threats. "General Morrison," Dr. Sterling said, and Katie felt something shift in her chest. Her hand tightened on the clipboard. "How are we feeling this morning?" "Ready to go home, Doctor." The general's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Can't sit still for long." Dr. Sterling began the examination, running through the rote checks with minimal attention. Katie moved to the vital station, checking the heart monitor, the O2 saturation, the blood pressure reading steady at 118/76. Everything normal. Everything stable. Everything exactly as it should be. She was so focused on the monitor that she almost missed it, the way Dr. Sterling's eyes moved across the chart, landed on the same cardiac support equipment line item, and then shifted to Katie's face. He was watching her. Measuring her. Calculating something. "Equipment seems excessive for your treatment plan," he said to the general, not looking away from Katie. "We've updated the ordering protocols. Should see those charges decline going forward." It was a lie. The charges wouldn't decline because the charges were the point. Katie knew this. She'd seen enough billing irregularities in her life to recognize the pattern. Someone was profiting from something. Someone was taking percentage points on medical supplies that patients didn't really need at the quantities being charged. The system was designed by people who understood that hospitals existed in 1,000 miles of bureaucratic noise, where a few $1,000s in unnecessary charges could hide forever if nobody looked too hard. And most people didn't look hard. Most people filed charts and moved on with their shifts. Katie had been trained to look hard at everything. At targets. At terrain. At patterns. At the gaps between what was said and what was true. "The general's recovery is progressing excellently," Dr. Sterling continued, and now he was smiling, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Keep up the excellent work, Katie. We're lucky to have nurses of your caliber." He pronounced her name like he was tasting something bitter. Then he turned and moved out of the room, his residents trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark back into deeper water. The general watched him go, then turned his head slowly toward Katie. His eyes met hers for the first time since she'd admitted him, and she saw something flicker there, recognition, maybe. Or just the sharp attention of a man who'd spent 40 years in the Marines learning to read people. "Good nurse," he said quietly. "I can tell. The way you move. You ever serve?" Katie's hands paused on the 4 line. "Just want to make sure you're comfortable, sir." She didn't wait for a response. She finished checking the 4, documented the visit in the chart, and moved out of the room with the same quiet efficiency that had carried her through 3 tours in Kandahar. The general watched her leave, his weathered hand moving to his left forearm, where beneath the hospital gown, if you looked closely, you would find a name tattooed in faded black ink, Katie Morrison. He'd gotten it done in 2011, 3 days after the medevac, after she'd dragged him from a burning Humvee while rounds snapped past her head like angry wasps. His memory of that day was fragmented by blood loss and morphine, but he remembered her face. He always remembered her face. The morning shift continued its rhythm. Medication passes, vital sign checks, the constant background noise of monitors and ventilators and the distant overhead paging system. By noon, Katie had documented 17 patient interactions, flagged 2 potential complications for physician review, and adjusted 3 medication regimens per protocol. Her shift would end at 3 o'clock. She would drive home to her 12-year-old daughter, who had questions that Katie couldn't answer without breaking the careful architecture of the new life she'd constructed over 3 years. She would make dinner. She would help with homework. She would read bedtime stories. And in the morning, she would return to Sacred Heart and move through these hallways again, invisible, competent, and entirely alone. That was when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You should know that Dr. Sterling just ordered a full audit of your employment history. He's concerned about the gaps in your resume. Thought you should have a heads up. A friend. The message arrived without a name, without a signature, without any indication of who would bother to warn a quiet nurse that someone in power was asking questions about the 7 years that Katie had no intention of explaining. She read it once. She read it twice. Then she deleted it and continued her shift as if the message had never arrived, but the message had arrived, and nothing in her careful world would ever be quite the same. The cafeteria at Sacred Heart smelled like industrial bleach mixed with something greasy and vaguely Italian, overcooked pasta sitting under heat lamps since 11 a.m. Katie pushed through the double doors at 12:22 p.m., moving against the tide of hospital staff flooding in for the lunch rush. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of white that made skin look like wax, and the noise level climbed with each arriving shift, voices bouncing off tile, the mechanical hiss of the soda dispenser, trays clattering against the aluminum counter. She was reaching for a salad when she heard the chair scrape. Dr. Sterling stood on one of the cafeteria chairs, his Italian leather shoes leaving marks on the plastic seat. He was tall enough that standing on furniture made him impossible to ignore. 40 or so nursing students, residents, and floor staff turned to look. He had that kind of presence that demanded attention not through volume but through sheer arrogant certainty that everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. His tailored jacket, probably $4,000, Katie thought with the precision that came from having priced expensive things once upon a time, hung perfectly as he straightened to his full height. "I'll make a bet," he announced, his voice cutting through the cafeteria noise like a scalpel through tissue. $50. Anyone here? I'm betting that our new nurse, the timid little mouse who's been creeping around these halls like she's afraid of her own shadow, won't last the week. Morrison, isn't it? Doesn't seem like emergency medicine material to me. Seems like she'd faint at the first drop of blood. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind that comes when a powerful man says something demeaning and everyone instinctively understands that laughing along is safer than not. Katie kept her eyes on the salad bar, her hand steady as she transferred letters to a plate. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. But every muscle in her back had gone taut, the kind of stillness that comes from years of being trained to move without being seen, to be present without being noticed. She looks like a strong wind could knock her over, Sterling continued, and something in his voice had shifted, not louder but sharper, like he was enjoying the sound of his own voice too much now. I bet you $100 that by Friday she'll be crying in a bathroom stall somewhere, realizing she's in way over her head. No one took the bet. But no one left either. They stood and watched, tray in hand, waiting to see what would happen next. Katie selected a bottled water and moved toward the register, her movements economical, efficient, the same way she'd moved through the corridors of a combat surgical hospital in Kandahar, where drawing attention could get you killed. She didn't know Sterling was going to follow her. The next moment happened in the strange slow-motion way that trauma memory works, where seconds stretch like taffy and every detail burns into the brain with photographic clarity. She was 3 steps away from the checkout, her tray balanced on one forearm, when Sterling stepped directly into her path. His shoes, those expensive Italian ones, scuffed the tile floor as he shifted his weight. "Oops," he said, but it wasn't accidental. Nothing about this was accidental. His hand came up and made contact with the edge of her tray. Not a gentle bump. A deliberate, forceful knock that sent the entire thing flying from her hands. The salad went first, letters spinning through the air like confetti. The plastic bowl hit the ground and shattered into 3 pieces. The water bottle followed in a graceful arc, hit the tile, and exploded across the floor in a spreading stain. For a moment, everything on the tray seemed to move in different directions. A tomato wedge rolled under a chair, croutons scattered like shrapnel, dressing pooled across the white floor. The cafeteria went dead silent. 40 pairs of eyes locked on the scene. No one moved. No one reached down to help. Some of the residents pulled out their phones. Katie could see the glint of screens, the way people angle them to capture video, to document humiliation and turn it into content. The smell of vinaigrette rose sharp and acrid, mixing with the institutional bleach. Katie took one measured breath. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The kind of breathing that steadies a sniper before the shot. Then she let a single tear escape from her left eye, not a breakdown, not hysteria, just one perfect tear that traced down her cheekbone. Her hand came up and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her gaze steady and level as a laser sight. "I've picked up better men than you'll ever be from worse places than this floor, Doctor." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. It came out steady as stone, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst things a person can survive. "I've done it under fire. I've done it in the dark. I've done it knowing I wouldn't make it home the same person I left." She knelt slowly, gathering the broken pieces of the tray, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The croutons went into her hand. The bowl fragments. The tomato wedge. She stayed on her knees for exactly 9 seconds, long enough for everyone in the cafeteria to see her composure, to understand that this wasn't defeat, this was something else entirely. Then she stood, dumped everything into the trash, and walked past Sterling without another word, her shoulders back, her head level, every single muscle in her frame broadcasting absolute control. The residents whispered as she left. Some of them were photographing her now, not her humiliation, but something else. Something they couldn't quite name. Katie didn't turn around. But that wasn't the worst part of what Sterling was planning. The next morning, during surgical rounds on the cardiac unit, Sterling reviewed a patient chart, not the general's, but a post-operative infection case, and walked directly to Katie. The attending surgeons watched, their attention sharpening. Sterling held the chart for exactly 2 seconds, enough time to be deliberate, then dropped it at her feet like she was a dog at heel. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with false civility. "You clearly didn't read it properly the first time. These medication dosages you questioned yesterday? They're perfectly appropriate. Standard protocol. But I wouldn't expect someone with your limited background to understand complex pharmacology." He turned back to the surgical team, his tone shifting to collegial warmth as he addressed them. "Some nurses get ideas above their pay grade." Katie bent slowly and retrieved the chart, her movements fluid and graceful as a dancer. Her fingers were steady as she straightened. The surgical team was watching her now, reading her face for some crack, some sign of shame or anger or breakdown. Instead, her voice came out soft and absolutely clear. "I've picked up better men than you'll ever be from worse places than this floor, Doctor." She said it the same way. The same tone. Like she wasn't speaking to Sterling at all, but to some distant memory only she could access. Then she opened the chart, reviewed the dosages with genuine interest, they were fine, he was right about that, and handed it to the charge nurse with a simple thanks before moving on to the next patient's vitals. Sterling's face had gone the color of undercooked meat. That afternoon, his office door was closed and his hands moved across his keyboard with quick, practiced efficiency. The first call was to Dr. James Harlow, a board member who had once required Sterling's discretion during a malpractice settlement that never made it to official review. Sterling's voice was smooth, almost apologetic, as he explained that Sacred Heart might have a problem, a nurse with significant gaps in her employment history, someone whose references were sparse and whose mental stability seemed questionable given her unusual reactions to routine criticism. The second call went to an external consulting firm that the hospital contracted for clinical audits. Sterling explained that he'd noticed concerning patterns in a new nurse's decision-making, particularly around questioning established protocols and billing procedures. Could they perhaps do a deep dive into her patient interactions? He wasn't trying to cause problems, he was just trying to protect the hospital's liability exposure. The third call was different. Sterling dialed the single reference number Katie had listed on her application, a clinic in Tacoma, Washington. He didn't identify himself as calling from Sacred Heart. Instead, he introduced himself as a potential employer, deeply interested in this applicant, but concerned about the gaps in her work history between 2003 and 2018. Was she unreliable? Did she have mental health issues? Had anyone ever raised concerns about her fitness to practice? The clinic director, a woman named Margaret Chen, listened politely and then said something that made Sterling's jaw tighten. "I'm not able to discuss that person with you. If you need information, you should contact the Naval Medical," but Sterling had already hung up. He sat in his office for a long moment after that final call, one hand flat on his desk, his breath coming slightly faster than normal. Someone had served. Someone in his hospital had actual military experience, real medical training beyond nursing school, and the kind of presence that made residents stop and listen. She had questioned his billing scheme with precision. She had spotted the supply discrepancies the way someone spots a threat. She was dangerous. But she was also dispensable. One phone call to the right people, one fabricated complaint here, one planted doubt there, and by next week she'd be gone. And with her gone, his arrangement with the supply company would continue undisturbed, $47,000 a month flowing into accounts registered under his sister-in-law's name, completely clean, completely deniable. He smiled to himself and picked up his phone again. The monitor alarm shrieked at 3 in the morning. A single high-pitched wail that cut through the sleeping hospital like a scalpel through silk. Katie was at the nurse's station reviewing discharge summaries when the sound registered, not the usual rhythm interruption, but something worse. Something that made her body move before her mind caught up. She was moving before the second alarm cycled. The general's room. Bay 412. Her feet carried her down the corridor with the muscle memory of 18 years, past the darkened patient rooms and the dozing residents, past the fluorescent haze of the main monitors. The hallway stretched like it always did in the deep hours, longer than it should be, the tile clicking beneath her shoes in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The general lay rigid against his pillows, one hand pressed hard against his chest. His other hand clawed at the sheets. His lips held that particular shade of blue that meant the body was screaming for oxygen and the heart was losing. Katie saw it all in the first second, the distended jugular veins like cables running up his neck, the shallow rapid breathing, the way his eyes rolled toward her with something between fear and recognition. She had seen this exact constellation of signs before. Not in a textbook. In the bloodstained triage tent at Kandahar Regional Medical Facility, where shrapnel didn't just wound, it punctured. It bled into spaces where blood had no business being. Pericardial tamponade. The sac surrounding his heart was filling with fluid. Each heartbeat was pumping against compression. Each second the pressure increased, the output decreased. In minutes, his heart would stop generating enough force to move blood at all. Katie's hands moved. One hand hit the call button while the other was already checking the monitor. Blood pressure 68/44 and dropping. Heart rate 134. Oxygen saturation 87 and falling. The numbers told the story of a body running out of time. "I need a crash cart and pericardiocentesis kit in 412 now," she said into the intercom. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Someone calm. Someone who had done this before. Dr. Sterling arrived in street clothes, blazer and dress shirt, no tie, still buttoning his cuffs. He'd been called from the on-call room, probably yanked from sleep, probably furious about it. He approached the bed with the posture of a man expecting a simple case. A man expecting to be right. He examined the general with a cardiologist's precision, placing his stethoscope, listening, checking the JVD again. Then he straightened and looked at Katie with the flat expression of someone whose diagnosis had already been decided before the examination was complete. Anxiety attack, Dr. Sterling said. Postoperative stress. I'm ordering lorazepam, 4 milligrams 4, and we'll keep him sedated through the night. He'll be fine by morning. Katie looked at the monitor. Pulsus paradoxus, the systolic pressure dropping more than 10 millimeters of mercury with each breath. Muffled heart sounds like they were coming through cotton. The clinical constellation that screamed one diagnosis and one diagnosis only. She had learned to speak in the military. Not to lecture. Not to argue. To state facts like they were already written in stone. Doctor, this is pericardial tamponade, Katie said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't plead. It just existed in the space between them like a fact about gravity. He needs emergency pericardiocentesis or heal arrest within minutes. Dr. Sterling's face didn't change. That was the worst part. His face didn't change at all. He looked at her like she had just suggested they treat the patient with crystals and prayer. Do not question my clinical judgment in front of the patient, Nurse Morrison, he said. Each word was a separate strike. You will administer the sedative I ordered, or you will step away from this patient and I will have you removed from this floor. The general's lips were moving. His eyes were locked on Katie's. She could see the moment his body registered the shift from hope to despair. She could see the moment he stopped believing he was going to survive this. Katie looked at the crash cart. She looked at the ultrasound machine just outside the room. She looked at Dr. Sterling's hands, which were steady and empty and absolutely useless. And she made the choice that would burn her career to ash within 5 hours. You can fire me in 5 minutes, Katie said. Not a request. Not a negotiation. A statement delivered in a voice that sounded like it was coming through a radio from very far away. Right now, I'm saving his life. She moved. Not fast, fast was panic, and panic made mistakes. She moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had done this on a stretcher in the back of a Chinook helicopter with the rotor wash shaking the aircraft and her patient bleeding out against her leg. The ultrasound machine hummed to life. Her hand slid the probe across the general's chest in a practiced arc, looking for the black space that meant fluid. There. 2 centimeters. Maybe 3. The pericardial sac swollen like a balloon filled with something other than air. She prepped the needle. A 14-gauge angiocath, long enough to reach the sac, short enough not to spear the ventricle. The xiphoid process, the bone at the base of the breastbone, was her landmark. Just below it. 60 degrees, moving cephalad toward the left shoulder. The angle of attack she had memorized from a trauma surgeon who had taught her while standing in a field hospital with incoming fire rattling the sandbags. You are committing career suicide, Dr. Sterling said. His voice had changed. The control was cracking. You will stop this procedure immediately or I will have security. Katie advanced the needle beneath ultrasound guidance. The general gasped. His body recognized what his mind was too afraid to hope, that someone was actually trying to save him. The needle slid through fascia. She felt the distinct give as it entered the pericardial sac, a sensation like a subtle pop, like breaking the surface tension of something that had been sealed. She withdrew the plunger. Dark blood came back. 60 milliliters. 70. The pressure releasing like air from a balloon. She could hear the change in the heart monitor before she saw it, the numbers climbing. Blood pressure rising. Oxygen saturation climbing. The heart no longer fighting to pump against compression. The general's color returned like someone had turned up the brightness on the world. His breathing deepened. His eyes locked onto Katie's for just a moment, and in that moment, something passed between them, not recognition exactly, but something older than recognition. Something that said, you know what it is to hold someone's life in your hands and refuse to let go. The cardiac surgeon arrived 90 seconds later, still pulling her coat on, still reading the monitors as she crossed the threshold. She took in the scene in a single glance, the patient alive, the vital signs stable, the pericardiocentesis kit in Katie's careful hands, and the expression on Dr. Sterling's face like someone had just deleted his entire life's work. The surgeon looked at the ultrasound, at the now empty pericardial sac, at Katie's hand steady as a surgical laser. Textbook pericardiocentesis, the surgeon said. She said it loud enough for the hallway to hear. You saved him. Dr. Sterling stood motionless for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked directly toward the nurse's station, his jaw working like he was trying to unhinge it, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Katie watched him pick up the phone, watched him punch in numbers with the methodical fury of someone who had just lost control of a situation and was about to detonate everything around him to make sure he went down swinging. She already knew who he was calling. She already knew what he was saying. She had seen this play before, in military courts, in command structures, in the architecture of institutional power. The guilty always moved the same way when they were about to be exposed. They attacked first. They attacked hard. And they used every weapon they had. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Sterling moved through Sacred Heart's administrative corridor like a man who understood how power worked, not as a title on a door, but as a series of favors owed, debts unpaid, secrets buried. The moment Katie's hands had steadied the general's chest cavity, the moment that needle had pierced his pericardium and the fluid had hissed out like air from a punctured lung, Sterling's mind had already calculated his next 12 moves. He couldn't let this stand. A timid little nurse didn't perform emergency procedures without authorization. A timid little nurse didn't save patients while attending physicians froze. A timid little nurse didn't become a threat to his $847,000 a year arrangement with Cascade Medical Supply. His phone was in his hand before the general's oxygen saturation stabilized above 94%. The first call went to board member Richardson at 3:19 p.m., a man who had been Sterling's personal physician 8 years earlier when a malpractice suit threatened his medical license. Sterling had buried that file so thoroughly that Richardson's insurance company still didn't know the patient had died from post-operative hemorrhage that could have been prevented. Richardson answered on the second ring. "I need a favor," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of someone calling in collateral. "There's a nurse on my floor. Performance issues. Patient safety concerns. I'm going to need support when this goes to the board." Richardson didn't ask questions. Men like Richardson understood that the phone calls made in private were the ones that determined which voices carried weight in boardrooms. "Done," Richardson said, and the line went dead. The second call went to board member Hayes at 3:27 p.m., a cardiac surgeon whose medical license had been quietly restored after a 3-year suspension that nobody outside of hospital administration remembered. Sterling had been the only physician who testified on his behalf, citing exemplary clinical judgment and isolated incident of judgment error under extreme stress. Hayes had been waiting 16 years to repay that debt. "I need her removed," Sterling said simply. "Insubordination. Patient endangerment. I'm building a file." Hayes's response came back immediately, "Who do I vote for?" Sterling didn't smile, but something cold and certain moved through him. This was how institutions worked. Not with justice or evidence, but with the careful arrangement of debts like stones in a carefully planned path. The third call went to board member Vasquez at 3:34 p.m., and this conversation was shorter. Vasquez had approved a $340,000 grant from Sterling's research budget to study a medication protocol that had turned out to be ineffective, but Sterling had written the positive findings anyway, and Vasquez had signed off. When Sterling's call came through, Vasquez's voice was already defensive. "Whatever you need," Vasquez said before Sterling had even asked. 3 board members. 3 conversations. 8 minutes. At 3:42 p.m., Sterling made his fourth call, this one to an outside consultant named Dr. Raymond Price, whose firm specialized in medical audits and performance evaluations, the kind of work that looked objective but was only as objective as the person paying the invoice. Price had worked with Sterling twice before, and both times had reached conclusions that matched Sterling's expectations precisely. "I need a rapid evaluation," Sterling said. "Nursing staff member. Multiple protocol deviations. I need documentation for the board meeting." Price understood immediately that this was not a genuine inquiry into performance. This was a contract. "I can have preliminary findings by tomorrow," Price said. "What's the narrative?" Sterling laid it out like an architect drawing blueprints: protocol violation, insubordination, reckless endangerment, failure to follow chain of command, possible substance impairment given the erratic behavior. Price would look at Katie's file, the gaps in employment history that Sterling had already highlighted, and construct a case that would be professionally damning without ever crossing into obvious fabrication. At 3:51 p.m., Sterling called Katie's former employers with a simple request: verify employment dates and circumstances of departure. The voice on the phone at her previous hospital was cautious, professional, revealing nothing. But the silence where words should have been, the careful non-statement about her departure from the military, that silence was everything Sterling needed. A gap. A mystery. An unexplained absence that could be interpreted as misconduct, as psychological instability, as anything that fit the narrative Sterling was building. By 4:17 p.m., the machinery was in motion. Katie didn't know any of this when the nursing director's secretary called her at 4:43 p.m. and said, "Dr. Sterling would like to see you in his office." Immediately. She was standing at the supply cabinet, restocking 14-gauge angiocath needles with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind rehearsed the vital signs of the patient in room 7, BP stable, O2 sat 96%, heart rate normalized. She set down the box of needles without hurrying, without any outward sign that she had heard the words that meant her world was about to collapse. When she entered Sterling's office at 4:51 p.m., the room contained 5 people. Sterling behind his desk with his fingers steepled in front of his face like a man praying to himself. Board members Richardson, Hayes, and Vasquez arranged in a semicircle of judgment. And Dr. Raymond Price, the external consultant, with a tablet in his hands and a carefully neutral expression that suggested he had read a narrative and was now performing his role in it. "Please sit," Sterling said, and the courtesy in his voice was the cruelest thing Katie had heard all day. Price didn't waste time. He read from the tablet as if reciting medical findings from a chart: protocol violation during the general's cardiac event, failure to notify attending physician before intervention, insubordination when challenged, pattern of independent action that suggested either arrogance or impairment. The words accumulated like water behind a dam. Multiple instances. Reckless endangerment. Patient safety risk. When Price finally looked up, his eyes held the kind of practiced sympathy that suggested he had destroyed careers before and would destroy more after. "Ms. Morrison," Richardson said, "these are serious allegations." Katie could have spoken. She could have explained the general's vital signs, the medical necessity, the 3-minute window before cardiac arrest became irreversible. She could have argued that saving his life was not a violation but the fundamental purpose of her work. She could have torn apart their narrative with the same precision she had torn open the general's pericardium. She didn't. Instead, she sat in a chair that seemed designed to make you smaller, and she said nothing. Her hands rested on her thighs. Her breathing remained steady. Whatever Dr. Sterling saw when he looked at her face, it wasn't the reaction he wanted. There was no shame, no fear, no tears. There was only a woman whose composure made his victory feel incomplete, like he had crossed the finish line while the crowds had already left the stadium. "We've made our decision," Vasquez said. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated for gross misconduct, patient endangerment, and insubordination. There is no appeal process." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Katie rose from the chair with the same unhurried movement she had brought to every moment of the last 4 days. She looked at Sterling for exactly 2 seconds, not with anger, not with defiance, but with the kind of recognition that suggested she had finally seen the full scope of what he was. Then she walked toward the door. "Security will escort you to collect your belongings," Sterling called after her, and there was something sharp in his voice, an edge of frustration that suggested he had expected something more, a breakdown, a confrontation, something that would have made his victory feel real. The security officer was waiting in the corridor with the kind of neutral expression that suggested this was not his first termination escort of the day. Katie's locker was on the 3rd floor, near the staff break room where she had eaten lunch exactly once during her 4 days at Sacred Heart. Her co-workers watched from a distance as she opened the locker and began removing her belongings. 2 pairs of compression socks. A small container of hand lotion. A thermometer. A pen with Sacred Heart Hospital printed on the side. Each item went into a cardboard box that the security officer held open with practiced efficiency. The jacket was on the hook. The one Katie wore over her scrubs, navy blue, unremarkable, the kind of thing 1,000 nurses wore across 1,000 hospitals. But sewn into the inside of the lining, hidden unless someone was looking, was a faded unit patch from the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse, from a place and time that Katie had spent for years trying to compress into a box small enough to carry. She took the jacket down. She held it for one long moment against her chest, feeling the weight of it the way some people feel the weight of prayer. The patch was barely visible, edges worn from years of being folded and refolded in the bottom of a duffel bag. When she finally folded the jacket and placed it in the box, her hands didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't quicken. Whatever was breaking inside of her, it was breaking in a place that didn't show on the outside. The badge reader at the hospital exit beeped once when the security officer deactivated her ID. That small electronic sound, the final confirmation that Katie Morrison, registered nurse at Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver, no longer existed in any official capacity, seemed to echo down the corridor like a closing door. She drove home in complete silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, her breathing measured and controlled like she was counting seconds until exfil, the military term for extraction, running through her mind on some deep level she couldn't access consciously. The drive from Sacred Heart to her apartment took 18 minutes. She knew this because she had timed it on her first day when she was still trying to build a life that made sense. Her apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, one for her daughter Maya, who was supposed to be at school until 3:41 p.m. Katie had no context for why Maya would be home at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday until she walked through the door and found her daughter at the kitchen table with a fever of 101.4 degrees and a note from the school nurse sent via text. Maya looked up from her phone when Katie walked in, and for a moment they just looked at each other, a mother who had just lost her job and was trying to maintain the architecture of composure, and a 12-year-old girl who had never seen her mother fall apart. "Mom." Maya's voice was small, confused. "Why are you home? Why are you?" She trailed off, seeing the cardboard box in Katie's hands, seeing something in her mother's face that didn't match any previous version of her mother that existed in her memory. Katie set the box down on the kitchen floor. The trembling started in her hands first, not the trembling of fear, but the trembling that comes when you have held yourself together so carefully for so long that the infrastructure finally gives. Her vision blurred. She sat down at the kitchen table, and the tears came like someone had opened a dam, and she couldn't answer her daughter's questions because speaking about why she had left the military would mean speaking about the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the unbearable weight of remembered faces that had belonged to people she couldn't save, people who had died anyway, despite everything she did, everything she carried, everything she had tried to become in the years since. "Mom." Maya moved to her, wrapping thin 12-year-old arms around a woman who had carried wounded Marines through desert fire, who had performed emergency surgery with nothing but a field kit and steady hands, who had kept breathing when breathing seemed impossible. "Mom, what happened?" Katie held her daughter and wept, and somewhere in that weeping was the sound of something fragile breaking, something she had built so carefully shattering like glass on tile, and she had no answer for her daughter except the terrible, impossible truth, "I don't know, baby. I don't know." 5 hours after they escorted Katie Morrison out of Sacred Heart with a cardboard box and a deactivated badge, she sat in her car in the parking lot, unable to turn the key. Rain hammered the windshield like applause that nobody was meant to hear. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the kind of grip that came from muscle memory, from holding a rifle steady, from refusing to shake even when everything inside was fracturing. The cardiologist's office had called twice. Her mother had texted 3 times. Her daughter was at school, and Katie had no idea what she would say when that bell rang at 2:45. The forgotten jacket was folded on the passenger seat. She'd driven back to Sacred Heart without thinking, muscle memory pulling her toward the place where she'd spent for days saving lives and hiding herself. The locker room had been empty except for a custodian mopping near the showers. Nobody had stopped her. Nobody had even looked. She'd grabbed the jacket, felt the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the insignia of her old battalion from Kandahar, the one nobody here knew about, the one she'd stitched into the fabric 3 years ago when she first took the nursing job because even anonymity needs an anchor, and she'd turned to leave. That's when the ER erupted. A patient screaming in Pashto. Nurses shouting. The sound of a gurney crashing through double doors. Katie's hands moved before her brain caught up. She was moving toward the sound, toward the chaos, because some things don't require thought. They require response. The stretcher wheeled past carrying a man in restraints, thrashing, his eyes wild, and he locked onto Katie the way a spotlight finds a stage. His body went rigid. The screaming stopped. He dropped to his knees on the tile floor, and his voice changed to something that sounded like prayer. "Angel of Kandahar," he whispered in Pashto. Then in English, "You saved me. You saved me even after we fought you." The ER went dead silent. The man was Hassan Mawari, a former Taliban military commander now seeking asylum, his case flagged as complex medical and political in equal measure. He'd been in Sacred Heart system for 3 days before being admitted with internal bleeding, a car accident, the intake note said, though the bruising pattern suggested something else. But Katie didn't know any of that yet. She just knew that his hands were shaking as he reached toward her, and the nurses were frozen, and something was shifting in the air pressure of the room like weather changing before a storm. Then her daughter walked through the ER doors. Mara had called the school office at 1 o'clock, told them she was sick, and waited in the nurses' station until Katie texted that she was heading home. Instead, Katie had texted her location. Instead, Mara had taken the bus to Sacred Heart. She was 12 years old and standing in a trauma bay in her school uniform, and she walked directly to her mother with her chin up and her shoulders back. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison," Mara said. Her voice was small but it carried. United States Navy. She served 12 years. 3 deployments. She's decorated. The ER staff stared at Mara, then at Katie, then at each other. A nurse at the front desk, Rodriguez, who'd watched Dr. Sterling humiliate Katie in the cafeteria, pulled up the personnel file with trembling fingers. She read aloud, her voice cracking on every word. Transfer records from Naval Medical Center San Diego. Honorable discharge. Service medals. Security clearance notation. Psychological evaluation, PTSD from combat trauma, receiving treatment, cleared for civilian medical practice, recommended for positions of authority. The file was 23 pages long, and everything about Katie's employment gap made sense now. Those weren't missing years. Those were healing years. The Marine General emerged from room 7, moving slower than he had been, and when he saw Katie, his hand went to his forearm. The tattoo. After 3 deployments and 2 wars and 18 years of his life lived in uniform, he'd gotten a tattoo of her name because he'd never gotten to say thank you properly. Never had the chance to find her. And then he'd shown up in her hospital 4 days ago and she'd been right there, quiet and careful and making decisions that saved his life. Recognition moved across his face like light. "Senior Chief," he said. It wasn't a question. Before Katie could answer, a voice cut through the room, a voice with the precise diction and controlled volume that came from 3 decades of military discipline. A SEAL team leader stood in the ER entrance, still in tactical gear from a training exercise at Fort Carson, visiting the general as part of medical clearance protocols. His name was Commander Hayes, and he'd served with Katie for 8 months in 2016, when she was still in uniform, and he was still calling her the best combat medic he'd ever worked alongside. 2 silver stars, he said. His voice was steady and it moved through the silence like a blade. Bronze star with Valor. 2 purple hearts. The highest medical decoration a Navy enlisted can receive, and she never told a single person in this hospital about any of it. He stepped forward and kept going, reading the record that had suddenly become very visible. Combat medicine certification. Jump wings. Scuba qualification. Expert rating in trauma surgery and field triage. 12 years of active service. 3-time nominee for Petty Officer of the Year. And 3 years ago, she walked away from all of it because the weight got too heavy, and she chose healing for herself over medals nobody would ever see. Dr. Sterling stood at the far end of the ER, his face draining of color like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed. His hands went to his sides and his fingers curled. Katie watched him calculate in real time, watched him understand that every move he'd made in the past 36 hours was about to collapse under the weight of what he'd just learned. The IT director appeared behind the front desk, tablet in hand. His name was James Kovac, and he'd been a Navy IT specialist for 8 years before his medical discharge. He moved toward Sterling with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you hold evidence that ends careers. Every security camera in this hospital has redundant storage in the cloud, Kovac said. You accessed the General's cardiac emergency file at 1,142 hours yesterday morning. You tried to delete the footage from Trauma Bay 1 at 1,307 hours. The footage of you standing frozen while a nurse performed an emergency pericardiocentesis that saved your patient's life. You failed to delete anything, Doctor. Every frame was preserved. Every system log. Every email you sent to the board members asking them to bury this file and the nurse's reputation. Sterling's jaw clenched. A muscle jumped in his neck. I've sent the complete digital archive to the medical board and the FBI, Kovac continued. His voice never changed volume. Healthcare fraud investigation. Insurance fraud. Obstruction of justice. The board members you called are cooperating. They provided copies of every conversation in which you threatened them. The supply company, Meridian Medical Solutions, has agreed to testify about their kickback arrangement in exchange for reduced charges. The ER was so quiet you could hear the ventilator in room 4 cycling its mechanical breath. Katie stood in the center of it, her daughter beside her with her chin still raised, her hand on Katie's arm, her whole body trembling not with fear but with something that looked like pride. Her daughter was seeing her for the first time. Not as a broken woman who'd hidden in the basement of a hospital, but as someone who'd carried other people through war and brought them home alive. Someone whose hands had learned to hold bleeding wounds and seal them closed. Someone who'd looked at a patient code and moved without hesitation. The fragile anonymity Katie had built for 3 years, the careful construction of invisibility, the quiet nursing competence, the refusal to let anyone see the medals or the scars or the nightmares, was gone. Shattered. And in that shattering, something else happened that Katie hadn't expected. Her daughter understood. Mara wasn't ashamed. She was holding her mother's arm like she'd hold a rope that wouldn't break, like Katie had been holding wounded Marines in the dark all this time, and now it was Mara's turn to hold on. Dr. Sterling reached for the wall to steady himself, and that's when the CEO of Sacred Heart walked through the ER entrance with 2 federal agents and a legal advisor, their badges already out, their documentation already prepared, because the hospital had made the call the moment the IT director flagged the suspicious file access and the falsified consultant report, and the 3 board members started texting each other about Sterling's threats. Everything Katie had lost in 5 hours was about to come back different. Not the same. Better. Because being seen had finally made her whole. And right now, in the ER of Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver, with her daughter's hand on her arm and a room full of witnesses who finally understood who she was, Katie Morrison breathed like a person stepping out of water after 3 years underwater. If you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've hidden a part of yourself to survive, this story is for you. Share this with someone who needs to know that the quietest person in the room might just be the strongest. Subscribe, like, and comment. Tell us about a time someone's hidden strength changed everything. Because the nurses, the teachers, the custodians, the single parents working double shifts, they might be carrying medals we'll never see.